Although you'll immediately recognize the horror of this event, you might not immediately appreciate the paranormal aspect of it. By the time my tale is told in its entirety, you'll understand why I consider this just one more episode of my paranormal life. For nearly a year in the late 1980s, I had been renting pasture for my horses behind the home of an elderly widow, Mrs. Conrad, who resided alone in the somewhat isolated last house at the edge of the small rural community where we lived. We had agreed from the onset I would pay the pasture rent with cash. In that year's time, we had become pretty good friends. She enjoyed telling me stories of her younger days, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to them. Her son, Mr. Conrad, was the chief of police in a city about 15 miles away. It was drizzling rain on this evening in early spring when I made the short drive to her house to tend to my horses, making sure I had cash on hand because the pasture rent was due that day. I parked my truck a few yards behind her little blue Chevette that was parked in the ramshackle garage at the end of the narrow driveway. If she were home, she would usually come outside and speak to me, and had on occasion even given me a home-baked pie. At the very least, she would stick her head out the back door just to acknowledge me. This evening she didn't. As I walked through her backyard toward the gate to the pasture, I felt as if someone was watching me. Expecting it to be Mrs. Conrad, I turned to wave hello, but she wasn't there. I walked on, and just as I reached the pasture gate, I again felt like someone was close enough to my left shoulder to have touched me. I stopped to turn, but just as before, no one was there. This really startled me because the feeling of not being alone was so strong. But wanting to find a retreat from the rain, I shrugged it off and went about my business. About an hour after finishing with my chores of tending the horses, I walked back to the driveway, re-entered my truck, and started to leave when I suddenly remembered I needed to pay her for the pasture rent. I stopped, grabbed the money, and headed toward the back door when I was suddenly overcome by a most dreadful feeling that stopped me in my tracks. I could not make myself take another step. I was a bit confused, wondering why I was feeling that I shouldn't approach the back door, and finally decided maybe I was sensing that she was resting or not feeling well. Not wanting to bother her, I turned to leave. Rethinking the situation after I got back to my truck, I decided I was being ridiculous, and I was also a little afraid she might get upset, thinking I was attempting to dodge my rent if I didn't pay her. So once again, with money in hand, I headed toward the back door. This time a feeling of impending doom swept over me and was so strong I simply couldn't ignore it, and I left without knocking on the door or speaking to her. Late that same night, my husband and I were awakened by a phone call from her son, Mr. Conrad. He had been trying without success to reach his elderly mother since early that same evening. He had called her friend from church to find she also was not home. So he concluded they must be out somewhere together. It was much later that evening when he did finally connect with his mother's friend, only to find she had just returned from being out of town and had not seen his mother that evening. Mr. Conrad, of course, became worried and drove to her home and entered it to investigate, and what he found was puzzling to say the least. His mother was not at home, and her vehicle was also not in the garage, but her purse was sitting on the couch, and even more startling, her glasses were on the carpeted floor. It didn't take a police chief to realize something was very wrong. Before he could reach for the phone to make the call to report her missing, the phone rang instead. The caller was the dispatcher on duty from the city police department where Mr. Conrad was police chief. The dispatcher asked to speak to Mrs. Conrad. Mr. Conrad identified himself and demanded the dispatcher reveal why she was calling his mother. The dispatcher explained a vehicle had been stopped by officers following a traffic offense of running a stop sign. Before the responding officers could approach the driver, a young man quickly exited the vehicle and fled the scene. Upon running the license plate number, the dispatcher quickly realized who the vehicle belonged to, and they were calling to ensure Mrs. Conrad was safe. Mr. Conrad quickly explained his mother was missing, and advised the dispatcher to forward his order to the officers on scene to give chase of the young man and to persist until they apprehended him. Mr. Conrad then called upon a Texas Ranger, whom was a friend of his, for assistance. One of his next calls was to me. Knowing that I made daily trips to his mother's home to tend to my horses, he explained the situation, stated they were searching for her, and asked if I had spoken to his mother while I was there. I explained I usually did visit with her, but today she did not come to the door, so I had not. Before ending our conversation, I offered assistance in the search, and my husband and I quickly dressed and arrived at her home about 10 minutes later to find other neighbors as well as Mrs. Conrad's 2 daughters there. Since his mother was not in her vehicle when it was stopped in the city and she wasn't at her home, Mr. Conrad proposed she may have been attacked, managed to flee her attacker, and might be hiding somewhere outside, having possibly been injured or unconscious and unable to return to the house after the young man had left in her vehicle. We quickly split up, and in the darkness with flashlights, while calling her name, we searched the barn where my horses were, the cellar in her backyard, all the bushes, and even across the dirt road where a neighbor's barn was located. All to no avail. The Texas Ranger arrived and entered the home with Mr. Conrad and his sisters. Seemingly within minutes, we heard the screen door slam open against the house, and one of her daughters ran from the home, heading down the driveway, screaming hysterically. I was near the end of the driveway, and I heard someone yell for me to grab her as she was running straight in my direction. I held out my arms, and she ran into them, continuing to scream and sob as I guided her back toward the front porch of the house. We all knew something was terribly wrong to invoke this reaction. The Texas Ranger then quietly explained, Mrs. Conrad was indeed inside the home, her bloodied and disfigured body wedged between the wall and a bed of the spare bedroom. She had been murdered, stabbed repeatedly with her own sewing shears. Shocked and horrified, my husband and I soon realized there was nothing more we could do here, and we left Mrs. Conrad's children to soak in the awful reality of the tragedy that had occurred to their dear mother. I barely slept the rest of the night. Have you ever wondered if one slight detour in our actions would change the outcome of the future for another? There I was, reliving the moments I was there earlier that day, and questioning in my mind if I had in fact knocked on her door instead of leaving without speaking to her, if the situation might have turned out differently and Mrs. Conrad might still be alive. First thing the next morning, I received a phone call from our small-town sheriff, requesting I return to Mrs. Conrad's home as he needed my assistance in attempting to piece together a timeline of the events that had taken place. In speaking to the sheriff, I explained I had arrived somewhere in the vicinity of 5:30 p.m. and left around 6:30 or so. I continued to explain I had not spoken with Mrs. Conrad as she hadn't opened the door, but that I knew she was home at the time as I recalled her vehicle was in the open garage when I left, as I had parked my truck in the driveway a short distance behind it. Through tears, I then confessed that I felt terrible, as the pasture rent was due that day, and although I had every intention of paying it, for some reason I didn't knock on her door to give her the money, adding that if I had, she might not have suffered this tragedy. After seeming to study me for a moment, the sheriff relayed to me that Mrs. Conrad's son had driven to his mother's home several times that evening to check on her, the first time being shortly after I had left at 6:30. At that time he reported her vehicle was not in the garage, causing him to assume his mother was out with her friend. The sheriff also disclosed to me that further investigation had revealed a large quantity of blood had soaked through the carpet but was not seen the night before because her killer had taken the time to clean the surface of the carpet with towels that were later found in her washing machine. The reality of the timeline hit me like a brick when I suddenly realized, as the sheriff was already aware, her killer was present in her home the entire time I was on the property. Mrs. Conrad had already succumbed to his terrible deed, and he would have had to have followed me out in her vehicle shortly after I had left in my truck. Did her killer believe that I lived there and was waiting for me to enter the house so he could kill me too? I had come within feet of reaching her back door, but something, or perhaps someone, had stopped me. Had Mrs. Conrad, after her death, come back to attempt to warn me to leave the premises from the onset of my arriving while I was walking through the backyard? And then again, not once, but twice, attempting to fill my very soul with a premonition of the terror that she knew awaited me if I had proceeded to her back door? Of course you can come to your own conclusion, but I believe my elderly friend was there with me, remaining in this earthly realm just long enough to protect me from the same fate that she had just endured. I remain forever grateful to her.